The afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains of my recovery room, casting soft patterns across the hospital bed, where I had spent the last 6 weeks healing. The steady beep of the heart monitor had become a familiar companion, a reminder that I was still here, still fighting, still recovering from the surgery that had nearly taken everything from me. I had grown accustomed to the quiet, the solitude, the gentle rhythm of healing. What I wasn't prepared for was the sound of my mother-in-law's voice cutting through that peace like a serrated blade, calling me a parasite in my own home while I could barely stand without assistance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The word echoed in my mind long after she said it, bouncing off the walls of my consciousness, each repetition sharper than the last. Parasite. As if the 4 in my arm, the medications lined up on my bedside table, and the surgical scars hidden beneath my loose clothing weren't evidence enough of what I had endured. As if the years of hard work, the late nights balancing spreadsheets, the countless client calls that had built our comfortable life meant nothing. But what Barbara didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined as she stood in my doorway with that look of contempt, was that I held a secret that would unravel everything she believed about her own independence, her own survival, and who had truly been the parasite all along. 6 weeks earlier, I had walked into the surgical center with David's hand in mine, trying to mask the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. The doctors had been cautious but optimistic about the procedure, explaining the risks with that clinical detachment that medical professionals master over years of practice. What should have been a routine operation had turned complicated, leaving me with a recovery timeline that stretched from weeks into months. The first days after surgery were a blur of pain medication and worried faces, David's anxious expression hovering at the edge of my vision, his mother Barbara arriving with casseroles and concerned questions that felt more like interrogations than comfort. In those early days of recovery, when I could barely lift my head from the pillow without waves of nausea washing over me, Barbara had seemed almost helpful. She would arrive in the afternoons, letting herself in with the spare key David had given her years ago, carrying Tupperware containers filled with food I was too sick to eat. She would sit in the chair by my bed, talking about her week, her friends, her apartment, filling the silence with a constant stream of words that required nothing from me but the occasional nod. At the time, I had been grateful for the company, for the distraction from the monotony of recovery, and the fear that perhaps I wouldn't heal as completely as the doctors promised. But somewhere around week 3, when the worst of the pain had subsided and I had begun the slow process of regaining my strength, Barbara's visits had taken on a different tone. The concerned questions became pointed observations about how long I had been in bed, about how David was managing everything, about the burden my recovery must be placing on the household. She started making comments about women she knew who had bounced back from surgery in days, not weeks, as if my body's timeline for healing was somehow a personal failing rather than a medical reality. By week 5, the comments had evolved into something more insidious. She would arrive earlier in the day, before David left for work, and I would hear her in the kitchen talking to him in low tones about responsibility and sacrifice. She started rearranging things in my home, moving items in the kitchen to what she called more logical places, folding laundry in ways I had never folded it, essentially marking territory in a space that wasn't hers to claim. When I would gently suggest that I preferred things the way they were, she would smile that tight smile and say something about how I needed to focus on getting better and let others handle the details. The morning everything changed started like any other recovery day. I had managed to shower with minimal assistance, a small victory that had left me exhausted but triumphant. I had dressed in comfortable clothes and made my way slowly to the living room, determined to spend at least part of the day somewhere other than the converted guest room that had become my world. The autumn sun was streaming through the bay windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. I had settled into the armchair with a book, thinking about how much progress I had made, about how soon I might be able to return to work, even if only part-time from home. That's when I heard the front door open and Barbara's voice calling out, not to me, but to David, who was working from his home office upstairs. She didn't know I was in the living room, positioned behind the high back of the armchair, essentially invisible from the entryway. Her footsteps moved through the foyer with the confidence of someone who felt entitled to every space in the house, And I heard her talking on her phone, her voice carrying that particular edge it got when she was speaking to one of her friends from the apartment complex. What I heard next made my blood run cold. She was complaining about having to come over again, about how exhausting it was to deal with someone who just wouldn't get better, about how some people milk their situations for all the attention and care they can get. She used that word, parasite, describing me to whoever was on the other end of the line as someone feeding off David's income, living in comfort while contributing nothing. The irony was so sharp it could have drawn blood. Here was Barbara standing in my home criticizing my recovery, completely unaware that the very apartment she was so proud of, the independence she constantly referenced, the comfortable retirement she enjoyed, all of it was built on a foundation I had been quietly, secretly maintaining for over 3 years. I sat frozen in that armchair, my book forgotten in my lap, listening as she continued her conversation. She moved into the kitchen, and I could hear cabinet doors opening and closing as she made herself tea, completely at home, completely certain of her position and her right to judge me. She talked about how David had always been too soft, too accommodating, how he needed someone to help him see reality. She mentioned that she had been discussing with David's siblings, Jennifer and Michael, about the situation, about concerns they all shared regarding how long this recovery was taking, and what it meant for David's future. The words stung, each one a small cut, but beneath the hurt, something else was building. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculating variety that sits in your chest like ice and forces you to think clearly, to plan carefully, to wait for exactly the right moment. I had spent 3 years protecting Barbara's pride, allowing her to believe that her late husband's modest pension was enough to cover her expenses, that she was managing independently, that she didn't need help from anyone. I had done it because David loved his mother and worried about her, because he had asked me to help without telling her, because I had believed that preserving her dignity was worth the monthly financial sacrifice we made. Every month for 38 months, I had quietly transferred $1,500 to cover Barbara's rent at Maplewood Senior Living Complex. I had set up automatic payments for her utility bills, her car payment, even her supplemental health insurance premiums that her pension didn't quite stretch to cover. I had done it through a separate account, carefully managed so that Barbara would never see my name on any transaction, so she could maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency that meant so much to her. David and I had agreed it was the kindest approach, the one that would allow her to age with grace and independence without the shame she would feel if she knew the truth. But kindness, I was learning, could be its own form of foolishness when extended to those who used your generosity as a foundation for their cruelty. As I sat in that armchair listening to Barbara disparage me, I felt the weight of every transfer I had authorized, every bill I had paid, every sacrifice David and I had made to our own savings and plans to ensure his mother never felt the sting of financial insecurity. The vacation we had postponed, the home renovations we had delayed, the retirement contributions we had reduced. All of it so that Barbara could live comfortably and maintain her pride. And here she was in my home, calling me a parasite while I recovered from surgery that had left me weak and vulnerable. When her phone conversation ended, Barbara came into the living room and startled when she saw me sitting there. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face, a calculation of how much I might have heard. But then she smoothed it away and smiled that tight smile I had come to recognize as her armor against genuine emotion. She asked how I was feeling with the kind of false brightness that made it clear she hoped I would say I was much better, that I would be back to normal soon, that this inconvenient period of recovery was nearly over. I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the expensive highlights in her hair that she got touched up every 6 weeks, the designer handbag that had been a gift to herself last Christmas, the comfortable shoes that cost more than most people spent on a week of groceries. I told her I had heard her phone conversation. The words came out calm, steady, despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. I watched the color drain from her face, then rush back in a flood of red as she prepared to defend herself, to justify her words, to somehow make it my fault that she had spoken. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. About me with such contempt. But before she could launch into whatever explanation or excuse she had prepared, I told her there was something she needed to know, something that would reframe everything she believed about parasites and independence and who had been supporting whom. The confusion on her face was almost comical as I slowly rose from the armchair, steadying myself against the armrest, and made my way to the home office where I kept all of our financial records. Barbara followed, her voice rising with questions I didn't bother to answer yet. I could feel the surgical site pulling slightly as I moved, a reminder of my body's fragility, but my mind had never been clearer. I opened the filing cabinet where I kept the folder labeled simply Barbara's expenses, and pulled out 3 years' worth of bank statements, transfer confirmations, and bill payment receipts. I laid them out on the desk one by one, watching as Barbara's eyes scanned the papers, seeing her name, her apartment complex, her utility companies, all with payment confirmations that traced back to accounts she had never known existed. The silence that fell over the room was profound, broken only by the sound of paper shuffling as she picked up statement after statement, her hands beginning to tremble as the full picture emerged. 3 years. 38 months. Over $50,000 in support that she had never acknowledged because she had never known it existed. Her mouth opened and closed several times, words failing her in a way I had never witnessed before. Barbara always had something to say, always had an opinion or observation ready, but in that moment, confronted with the evidence of her dependence on the very person she had just called a parasite, she was speechless. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of the revelation settle over both of us. Part of me wanted to be gentle, to soften the blow, to protect her from the shame I knew she must be feeling. But a larger part of me, the part that had just been called a parasite, while recovering from surgery, the part that had overheard her poisoning my husband's mind against me, that part wanted her to sit with the full discomfort of what she had done. Finally she found her voice, and what came out was exactly what I expected. Denial. She claimed there must be some mistake, that she paid her own bills, that her pension covered everything she needed. I simply pointed to the numbers, the dates, the confirmation codes that any call to her apartment complex or utility companies would verify. Then came the anger, the accusations that I had done this without her knowledge or permission, as if supporting her financially was somehow a violation rather than a kindness. I let her rage, standing there in my office doorway, still weak from surgery, but stronger in that moment than I had felt in weeks. When her anger exhausted itself against the immovable wall of documented evidence, Barbara tried a different approach. She suggested that if this was true, which she still wasn't fully admitting, then it was David who had arranged it, David who had made these decisions, and therefore David's money, not mine. This was perhaps the most insulting assumption of all, the deeply ingrained belief that even in a marriage, even when I was the higher earner, any financial support must have originated with her son rather than his wife. I corrected her quietly but firmly, explaining that these payments came from my personal earnings, from my career as a senior financial consultant, from work I had built over years of education and professional development. I told her about the promotions I had earned, the clients I had secured, the reputation I had built in my field that allowed me to command rates that made supporting her possible. I explained how David and I had discussed it as partners, how he had worried about her but respected that the financial capability to help came from my income, not his. I watched as this information settled over her, adding another layer to her humiliation, the realization that the woman she had dismissed as a parasite was in fact the financial backbone not just of her son's household but of her own comfortable existence. The transformation in Barbara's demeanor was not immediate, nor was it graceful. She stood in my office doorway, her carefully maintained composure crumbling like a sandcastle against an incoming tide. Her hands gripped the doorframe as if she needed the physical support, and I watched as her face cycled through expressions I had never seen her wear before. The shock had faded, replaced now by something more complicated, a mixture of shame and resentment that twisted her features into an unfamiliar landscape. She opened her mouth several times, each attempt at speech dying before any words could form, and in those moments of her silence, I felt the power dynamic between us shift so fundamentally that the air in the room seemed to change pressure. I remained standing near the desk, the folder of financial documents spread before me like evidence in a courtroom. My body ached from the exertion of retrieving them, the surgical site sending small warning signals that I was pushing too hard too soon, but I refused to show any weakness now. Not when Barbara was finally seeing me clearly for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the office floor, and somewhere in the house I could hear the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds of a home continuing its rhythm despite the earthquake happening within its walls. Barbara finally managed to speak, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. She asked why we had done this, why we had kept it secret, and there was an accusatory note still clinging to the question, as if our discretion had been a form of deception rather than kindness. I moved slowly back to the desk chair and lowered myself into it, mindful of my limitations, and took a moment before responding. I explained that David had been worried about her after his father passed away, that we had both known the pension wouldn't stretch to cover her desired lifestyle, that we had wanted to help without making her feel diminished or dependent. I told her that maintaining her dignity, preserving her sense of independence, had been the entire point of structuring the support this way. She absorbed this information with visible difficulty, her pride warring with the undeniable facts laid out before her. She asked how long David had known she was struggling, and I could hear the hurt beneath the question, the realization that her son had been aware of her financial fragility and had discussed it with me, his wife, perhaps before ever discussing it with her. I chose my words carefully, explaining that he hadn't wanted her to worry, that he had seen the stress she was under trying to maintain appearances after his father's death, that this had been an act of love, not pity. But even as I said these things, I could see them landing like stones, each one adding to the weight of her humiliation. The conversation shifted then, as Barbara tried to regain some foothold of control. She suggested that now that she knew, we could discuss a proper arrangement, something formal, perhaps a loan that she could pay back over time. The suggestion was absurd given her financial reality, and we both knew it, but I understood what she was really asking for. She wanted to reframe this revelation as a business transaction, something with terms and conditions that would restore some measure of her autonomy. I might have agreed, might have played along with this fiction to ease her discomfort, if not for what I had overheard earlier, if not for the word parasite still echoing in my memory, if not for the weeks of subtle cruelty disguised as concern. Instead, I told her that we needed to address what I had heard during her phone conversation. I watched her face flush again, the red creeping up from her collar to her hairline, and she immediately began to minimize it, claiming I had misunderstood, that I hadn't heard the full context, that she had been venting frustrations that everyone feels when dealing with illness in the family. But I didn't let her retreat into these comfortable lies. I repeated back to her, word for word as best I could remember, what she had said about me, about milking my situation, about being a burden on David, about her concerns that I was taking advantage of her son's good nature. The specificity of my recollection left her no room to maneuver. She couldn't claim I had misheard when I could quote her so precisely. She tried a different approach then, suggesting that I was being overly sensitive, that recovery was making me emotional and prone to taking things the wrong way. This particular deflection, this suggestion that my justified anger was really just a symptom of weakness or irrationality, sparked something fiercer in my chest. I had been called many things in my professional life, but never had anyone successfully dismissed my perceptions as emotional overreaction. I had built a career on reading situations accurately, on assessing financial risks and human behaviors with precision, and I would not allow her to rewrite reality simply because it was uncomfortable for her to face what she had done. I stood again, ignoring the protest from my healing body, and told her that she needed to leave. The words came out steady and final, and I could see the shock register on her face. She had expected many things from this confrontation, perhaps tears, maybe anger, possibly even forgiveness, but she had not expected to be asked to leave. She protested immediately, saying this was her son's house too, that she had every right to be here, that David would never support me throwing her out. I corrected her quietly but firmly. This was our house, mine and David's, and while he certainly had equal say in who visited, I had every right to ask someone to leave when they had been cruel to me in my own home, regardless of their relationship to my husband. Barbara's face hardened then, and I saw a flash of the steel that had allowed her to maintain her facade of independence for so long. She told me that I was making a mistake, that David would hear about this conversation, that I was damaging my relationship with my husband by treating his mother this way. The threat was implicit but clear. She would position herself as the victim in this scenario, paint me as the unreasonable one, force David to choose sides in a conflict I had not started but was now determined to finish on my terms. I told her that David would indeed hear about our conversation, but that he would hear my version of it, complete with the evidence of our financial support and the details of her phone conversation that I had overheard. She left then, not with any grace or acknowledgement, but with the stiff dignity of someone who had been defeated but refused to admit it. I heard her gather her things from the kitchen, heard the sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor, heard the door close behind her with more force than necessary. Only when the sound of her car engine faded down the street did I allow myself to sink back into the desk chair, my hands trembling now that the confrontation had ended, my body reminding me with sharp insistence that I was still healing, still vulnerable, still recovering from a trauma that was physical even if this newest wound was emotional. I sat in the quiet office for a long time, watching the dust motes drift through the afternoon light, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me felt triumphant, vindicated, finally seen and heard after weeks of being diminished and dismissed. But another part felt something more complicated, a sadness that it had come to this, that kindness had been met with contempt, that family relationships could fracture so completely over pride and misunderstanding. I thought about David, about how he would react when he heard about this confrontation, about the position this would put him in between his mother and his wife. The sound of the garage door opening pulled me from my thoughts. David was home earlier than expected, and I heard his footsteps moving through the house, calling my name with a note of concern in his voice. He found me in the office, still surrounded by the scattered evidence of our secret support for his mother, and his expression shifted from concern to confusion to understanding as he took in the scene. He asked what had happened, and I could hear in his voice that he already knew something significant had occurred, that the energy in the house had changed in ways he could sense even without knowing the details. I told him everything. I started with the phone conversation I had overheard, watched his face darken as I repeated his mother's words, saw the hurt flash across his features at the realization that she had been working to undermine me behind my back. Then I explained the confrontation, the revelation of our financial support, her reactions ranging from denial to anger to attempted justification. I showed him the documents I had pulled, the 3 years of statements and confirmations, though he had known about these payments, had been part of the decision to structure them discreetly. He had never seen them all laid out like this, never confronted the full scope of what we had sacrificed to maintain his mother's comfort. David sank into the other chair in the office, his hands running through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his processing mode. He was quiet for a long time, and I let him be, understanding that he was wrestling with his own complicated feelings about his mother, about loyalty and disappointment and the gap between who we want our parents to be and who they actually are. Finally he spoke, and what he said surprised me. He apologized. Not for his mother's behavior, which was hers to own, but for not recognizing sooner how she had been treating me, for not being more present during my recovery, for allowing his concern for her to blind him to her casual cruelties toward me. His apology cracked something open in my chest, and I felt tears threatening for the first time since this entire situation had begun. I had been so focused on staying strong, on maintaining control, on not showing weakness that might be used against me, that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge how much Barbara's behavior had actually hurt me. The word parasite had burrowed deep, not because I believed it was true, but because it represented such a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was, what I contributed, and the value I brought not just to my marriage but to the extended family system that included her. David moved his chair closer and took my hands in his, careful of the foresight that was still healing, mindful of my physical fragility even as we dealt with this emotional storm. He told me that he loved his mother, but that he loved me more, that his primary loyalty was to me and to the life we had built together. He said that he should have set clearer boundaries with her from the beginning, should have been more aware of how she spoke to me and about me, should have protected me better during this vulnerable time. He acknowledged that his desire to help his mother had inadvertently created a situation where she felt entitled to judge me, to criticize our choices, to insert herself into our lives without respect for our boundaries. We talked for hours that evening, sitting in the office as the light faded and the room grew dark around us. We discussed how to move forward, what boundaries needed to be established, how to handle the financial support we had been providing. David was clear that he didn't want to cut his mother off completely, that despite her behavior, he still felt a responsibility to ensure she wasn't destitute. But he also recognized that the current arrangement, predicated on secrecy and enabling her to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford while judging those who made it possible, was untenable. We decided that we needed to have a family meeting, one that included not just Barbara, but also David's siblings, Jennifer and Michael. Barbara had mentioned discussing concerns about me with them, which meant they were already involved whether we liked it or not. David called them both that evening. Brief conversations that outlined the basics of what had happened and requested they come over the following weekend for a family discussion. Both agreed, though I could hear the tension in their responses even from across the room. They knew their mother, knew her capacity for spinning situations to her advantage, and they were likely already bracing for whatever version of events she would present to them. The week that followed was strange and quiet. Barbara did not call or visit, which was a break from her previous pattern of daily check-ins during my recovery. I found myself both relieved by her absence and oddly unsettled by it, as if the silence itself was a form of strategy, a regrouping before the next battle. David went to work each day, but I could see the stress weighing on him, the tension in his shoulders, the distraction in his eyes. He was a man caught between competing loyalties, trying to honor both his mother and his wife while recognizing that in this situation, doing right by one meant disappointing the other. I used the quiet week to continue my physical recovery, pushing myself a little harder each day with the exercises the physical therapist had prescribed. My body was healing faster than my emotions, the surgical site closing and strengthening, while the wound of Barbara's betrayal remained raw and tender. I found myself playing the confrontation over and over in my mind, wondering if I should have handled it differently, if I should have been more gentle, or if I had been exactly as firm as the situation required. Doubt is a familiar companion to anyone who has had to stand up for themselves, the second-guessing that comes after the adrenaline fades and you're left wondering if you were justified or just cruel. By the time Saturday arrived, the day of the planned family meeting, I had worked through most of those doubts and arrived at a place of clarity. I had not been cruel. I had been honest. I had not attacked Barbara. I had defended myself. And, most importantly, I had not created this situation. I had simply refused to continue pretending that her behavior toward me was acceptable just because she was my husband's mother. These truths steadied me as I prepared for what I knew would be a difficult conversation, one that might permanently alter the family dynamics that had existed for years. Jennifer arrived first, pulling into our driveway in her silver sedan just after 10 in the morning. She was David's younger sister, a high school teacher with 2 kids of her own and a practical demeanor that had always made her easier to talk to than Michael, who tended to mirror their mother's more dramatic tendencies. I watched from the living room window as she sat in her car for a moment before getting out, clearly steeling herself for whatever was about to unfold. When she finally walked up to the door, David greeted her with a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual, both of them drawing comfort from the sibling bond they had shared since childhood. Jennifer came into the living room where I was seated, having decided to conserve my energy by not standing to greet everyone. She gave me a careful hug, the kind that showed she was aware of my recovery status, and asked how I was feeling with genuine concern in her voice. I appreciated that she started there, with my health, rather than immediately diving into the family drama that had prompted this gathering. We made small talk for a few minutes, discussing her kids and their school activities, the weather turning cooler, the normalcy of these topics providing a brief buffer against the tension we all knew was coming. Michael arrived about 15 minutes later, his truck rumbling into the driveway with characteristic noise. He was the middle child, working in construction management, and had always been the one most likely to take their mother's side in any family disagreement. He had inherited her tendency toward strong opinions delivered with absolute certainty, and I braced myself for his reaction to what he was about to learn. He greeted David with a handshake that turned into a brief hug, nodded at me with a tightness around his eyes that suggested Barbara had already given him her version of events, and sat down in the armchair with his arms crossed over his chest, his body language screaming defensiveness before the conversation had even begun. Barbara was the last to arrive, and the delay felt intentional, a power play that announced her displeasure at being summoned to what she likely viewed as an ambush. When she finally walked through the door that David had left unlocked for her, she moved with rigid dignity, her purse clutched in front of her like a shield, her expression carefully neutral in a way that took visible effort to maintain. She barely glanced at me, directing her greetings solely to her children, kissing each of them on the cheek before taking her seat on the far end of the couch, as physically distant from me as the seating arrangement would allow. The living room suddenly felt smaller with all of us gathered there, the autumn sunlight streaming through the bay windows doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled over the space. David stood near the fireplace, positioning himself where he could see everyone, and I recognized this as his attempt to mediate, to be the neutral party even though he was anything but neutral in this situation. He cleared his throat and began by thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging that this was difficult but necessary, and asking that we all try to listen to each other with respect and openness. Barbara interrupted before he could go further, her voice sharp despite the controlled volume. She announced that she knew what this was about, that I had made accusations against her, and that she was here to set the record straight before her children were poisoned against her. The preemptive strike was classic Barbara, seizing control of the narrative before anyone else could frame it, positioning herself as the victim of my unreasonable behavior rather than the instigator of a conflict born from her own cruelty. I felt my jaw tighten but forced myself to remain quiet, to let David handle this as he had asked to do. David held up his hand, a gesture asking for patience, and explained that this wasn't about accusations, but about clarifying some misunderstandings and establishing boundaries going forward. He outlined the basic situation without editorial, stating simply that I had overheard Barbara on the phone making disparaging comments about me, that this had led to a confrontation where certain financial arrangements had been revealed, and that we needed to discuss as a family how to move forward in a way that respected everyone involved. His tone was measured, diplomatic, the voice of someone trying desperately not to choose sides even though he had already chosen mine in private. Michael jumped in immediately, directing his question to Barbara and asking what she had actually said on the phone. This surprised me slightly because I had expected him to defend his mother without question, but perhaps the vagueness of David's summary had made him uncertain about where his loyalty should land. Barbara waved her hand dismissively and claimed that she had simply been venting normal frustrations to a friend, that adult children and their spouses always cause some stress, that I was being oversensitive about remarks taken out of context. She looked at me then for the first time since arriving, her eyes challenging me to contradict her in front of her children, to prove that I had heard what I claimed to have heard. I met her gaze steadily and spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I told them exactly what I had heard, using the specific words Barbara had used, including being called a parasite, including her complaints about my recovery taking too long, including her suggestions to her friend that I was milking the situation for attention. I watched Michael's face change as I spoke, the certainty draining from his expression as the specific details made it harder to dismiss my account as oversensitivity. Jennifer looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with the tension but also processing what these words meant, what they revealed about their mother's attitude toward me. Barbara tried to interrupt, to minimize, to claim that I was twisting her words, but David spoke firmly, asking her to let me finish. I continued, explaining that what hurt wasn't just the words themselves but the realization that while I was recovering from surgery, while I was vulnerable and dependent on others in a way I had never been before, she had been judging me harshly and working to turn David against me. I explained that trust had been broken, not by anything I had done, but by her willingness to speak about me with such contempt while accepting our hospitality and pretending concern to my face. The room went quiet after I finished speaking, the kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken thoughts and shifting allegiances. Jennifer was the first to break it, asking Barbara directly if what I said was accurate, if she had really used those words. The question came from a place of genuine confusion, as if Jennifer couldn't quite reconcile the mother she knew with the person who would call someone a parasite during their medical recovery. Barbara's face flushed and she stumbled over her response, first denying, then admitting she might have said something that could be interpreted that way, then finally settling on the defense that she had been worried about David, about the burden on him, about whether I was really as sick as I appeared to be. That last comment, the suggestion that I might be exaggerating my illness, sparked something fierce in David. He had been trying so hard to remain diplomatic, to facilitate rather than take sides, but the implication that I was faking or exaggerating my medical condition crossed a line he couldn't ignore. He spoke with an edge I rarely heard in his voice, reminding his mother that she had been at the hospital after my surgery, that she had seen me in the immediate aftermath when I couldn't even sit up without assistance, that she had been present for doctors' consultations where the complications had been explained in detail. He asked her directly how she could question the legitimacy of my recovery, when she had witnessed firsthand how serious the medical situation had been. Barbara backtracked quickly, claiming that wasn't what she meant, That of course she knew I had been genuinely ill, that she was just concerned about the timeline and whether I was pushing myself enough to recover faster. This pivot was almost more insulting than the original implication, suggesting that my recovery was slow because I wasn't trying hard enough rather than because my body needed time to heal from a significant trauma. I could feel the anger rising in my chest again, but I took a deep breath and reminded myself that losing my temper would only allow Barbara to paint me as irrational or overly emotional. Jennifer asked the question that shifted the entire conversation. She wanted to know what financial arrangements David had mentioned, what had been revealed during the confrontation that apparently mattered enough to include in this family meeting. I saw Barbara's face go pale, and I knew she had been hoping this particular detail would somehow be glossed over, that we could resolve the interpersonal conflict without exposing her financial dependence on the daughter-in-law she had been so quick to disparage. David looked at me, a silent question about whether I wanted to explain or if he should, and I nodded for him to continue. He explained it simply and without drama. For the past 3 years, since shortly after their father's death, David and I had been providing financial support to Barbara to help cover her living expenses. The support was substantial and ongoing, covering her rent, utilities, car payment, and supplemental insurance premiums. The total amount over 3 years was approximately $54,000, all coming from our household income, specifically from my earnings as a financial consultant since I was the higher earner in our marriage. He explained that we had structured it discreetly, wanting to help without making Barbara feel dependent or diminished, believing that preserving her dignity was worth the sacrifice to our own savings and financial goals. The reactions were immediate and varied. Michael's mouth actually fell open, his certainty about defending his mother evaporating in the face of this revelation. Jennifer's eyes widened, and she looked between Barbara and me as if seeing both of us for the first time. Barbara herself seemed to shrink in her seat, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of this exposure to her children. She had worked so hard to maintain the image of independence, of managing just fine on her own, and now that facade was crumbling in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to her. Michael found his voice first, asking why they hadn't been told, why he and Jennifer hadn't been approached to help contribute, why this had been kept secret. There was hurt in his question, a feeling of being excluded from family business, but also perhaps some relief that he hadn't been asked to shoulder this financial burden himself. David explained that it had been our decision to handle it privately, that we had the means to do so without hardship at least initially, and that Barbara had never actually known about the arrangement until the confrontation earlier in the week. This last detail seemed to shock Jennifer most of all. She turned to Barbara and asked how she thought her bills were being paid, how she thought her pension was stretching to cover everything when everyone knew it wasn't enough. Barbara's response was defensive and somewhat vague, something about being careful with money and making sacrifices and not questioning good fortune too closely. But the weakness of this explanation was apparent to everyone in the room. She had known on some level that the numbers didn't add up, but she had chosen not to look too closely at the math, because doing so would have forced her to confront her dependence on others. Jennifer asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. She looked at her mother with a mixture of disappointment and confusion, and asked how Barbara could accept so much financial help from me, while simultaneously calling me a parasite behind my back. The hypocrisy was laid bare in that simple question, impossible to ignore or explain away. Barbara tried to answer several times, her mouth opening and closing, different justifications starting and then dying as she realized how hollow they would sound. Finally, she settled on a weak claim that she hadn't known about the financial support when she made those comments, as if ignorance of her own dependence somehow excused her cruelty toward me. But this defense fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. The phone conversation I had overheard had happened just days ago, and Barbara had been receiving our financial support for 3 years. Even if she claimed not to have known consciously, she had been living in an apartment she couldn't afford, driving a car whose payments exceeded her budget, maintaining a lifestyle that her pension alone could never support. She had chosen not to question where the money was coming from, had allowed herself to believe in her own self-sufficiency while simultaneously accepting help she refused to acknowledge. And from that position of willful ignorance, she had felt entitled to judge me, to criticize my recovery, to call me a parasite for being temporarily dependent during a medical crisis while she had been permanently dependent for years. Michael ran his hands over his face, a gesture of frustration and overwhelm. He asked David directly if this financial support was going to continue, and I could hear the complexity beneath the question. Part of him was probably hoping we would say yes so that he wouldn't have to step up and contribute himself. Another part might have been hoping we would say no, either because he felt we were enabling their mother's unrealistic lifestyle, or because he was angry on our behalf about how she had treated me. David didn't answer immediately, instead looking at me to include me in the decision, recognizing that this was as much my choice as his since the money came primarily from my income. I spoke carefully, having thought about this question extensively over the past week. I explained that I was not interested in punishing Barbara financially, or leaving her in a situation where she couldn't meet her basic needs. Despite how she had treated me, I didn't want to be the person who caused an elderly woman to lose her housing or go without necessities. However, I was also not willing to continue the current arrangement where we provided substantial financial support, while she maintained the illusion of independence, and felt free to judge and criticize me. Any ongoing support would need to be transparent, acknowledged, and come with clear boundaries about respect and behavior. I proposed that we restructure the arrangement so that all three of her children contributed proportionally based on their incomes, making it truly a family effort rather than something David and I carried alone. I suggested that Barbara would need to move to a less expensive apartment, something her pension could cover with modest supplemental help rather than the substantial subsidies she currently required. I made clear that my willingness to contribute anything at all moving forward was contingent on Barbara acknowledging what we had done for her, apologizing for her treatment of me, and committing to treating me with basic respect and courtesy going forward. The conditions hung in the air, reasonable but firm, and I could see everyone processing them through their own lens. Jennifer nodded slowly, seeming to find the proposal fair. Michael looked less certain, probably calculating what his share of the financial responsibility would be. Barbara looked stricken, facing the collapse of her comfortable lifestyle and the requirement that she humble herself and admit her dependence. David squeezed my hand, a gesture of support and perhaps relief that I was still willing to help his mother at all after everything that had happened. Barbara finally spoke, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. She said that she appreciated everything we had done, that she hadn't meant to sound ungrateful, that she would try to do better. It wasn't quite an apology, not a full acknowledgement of the harm she had caused, but it was perhaps as close as Barbara could come in this moment to admitting fault. I waited, letting the inadequacy of her response sit in the room, letting her feel the weight of what a real apology would require. David waited too, and I could see the internal struggle on his face, his desire to let her off the hook warring with his recognition that I deserved more than this half-hearted attempt at contrition. Jennifer, surprisingly, was the one who pushed harder. She told her mother directly that what she had said about me was cruel, and that taking care of someone during medical recovery wasn't being a parasite, it was being a family. She pointed out that Barbara herself had been dependent on our care, financial and otherwise, and that calling someone a parasite for needing help was hypocritical and hurtful. She said that if they were going to move forward as a family, Barbara needed to actually apologize and mean it, not just offer vague statements about doing better. The silence that followed Jennifer's words was profound and uncomfortable. Barbara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. I could see the pride warring with necessity, the lifelong habit of maintaining control battling against the reality that she had lost the moral high ground entirely. Her eyes moved around the room, landing briefly on each of her children before finally settling on me. The look she gave me was complex, layered with resentment and shame, and perhaps the beginning of genuine remorse, though it was impossible to tell which emotion would ultimately win out. She cleared her throat twice before managing to speak, and when the words finally came, they emerged slowly, as if each one cost her something to produce. She said my name, Jessica, perhaps the first time she had addressed me directly since arriving, and told me that she was sorry for what she had said on the phone. She admitted that her words had been cruel, and that I didn't deserve to be spoken about that way, especially during my recovery. She acknowledged that she had been unfair in her judgments, and that she had allowed her own anxieties about David to cloud her perception of me and our situation. It wasn't a perfect apology, and I could hear the resistance still present in her tone, but it was more genuine than anything she had offered before. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish completely before responding. When she fell silent, I took a moment to gather my thoughts, aware that how I responded now would set the tone for our relationship moving forward, assuming we had one at all. I told her that I appreciated her apology, and that I understood family dynamics were complicated, especially when adult children married and created new primary relationships that shifted old loyalties. I acknowledged that my marriage to David had changed his availability to her in ways that were probably difficult, and that watching him care for me during my recovery might have triggered fears about being replaced or forgotten. But I also made clear that understanding the potential sources of her behavior didn't excuse it. I explained that being called a parasite had cut deeply, not just because the word itself was cruel, but because it revealed how little she actually knew or valued me despite years of being part of the same family. I told her that I had worked my entire adult life to be independent and self-sufficient, that I had built a successful career through dedication and skill, and that accepting help during a medical crisis didn't negate any of that. I pointed out that she herself had been accepting help for years, and that perhaps her harsh judgment of my temporary dependence came from her own discomfort with her permanent reliance on others. Barbara flinched at this last observation, and I could see Michael shifting uncomfortably in his seat, clearly uneasy with the direct confrontation even though everything I was saying was factually accurate. Jennifer, however, was nodding slightly, seeming to appreciate that I was being honest without being unnecessarily harsh. David remained near the fireplace, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease slightly as the conversation moved from accusations toward something that might eventually resemble resolution. I continued, explaining that moving forward would require real changes, not just in financial arrangements but in basic respect and boundaries. I told Barbara that she couldn't continue to have unlimited access to our home and our lives while harboring resentment toward me or speaking about me disparagingly to others. I made clear that any future relationship between us would need to be built on mutual respect, honesty about the support we were providing, and clear boundaries about what topics were open for discussion and what decisions were ours alone to make as a couple. I acknowledged that this might be difficult for her, that it represented a significant shift from the dynamic that had existed before, but that these changes were non-negotiable if we were going to maintain any kind of family connection. Jennifer spoke up then, addressing both her mother and her brother. She said that she thought what David and I were proposing was more than fair given the circumstances, and that she was willing to contribute financially to their mother's support going forward if the costs were distributed among all three siblings. She acknowledged that she couldn't match what we had been paying because her teacher's salary and her own family expenses limited her resources, but that she could commit to a reasonable monthly amount. She looked at Michael expectantly, putting subtle pressure on him to also commit rather than leaving the entire burden on David and me or forcing Barbara to manage entirely on her limited pension. Michael was clearly conflicted, his face showing the internal calculation of his own finances against his sense of obligation to his mother. He asked specific questions about what Barbara's actual expenses were, what her pension covered, and what the gap was that needed to be filled. David pulled out a document he had prepared, a simple breakdown of Barbara's current expenses versus her pension income, showing the monthly shortfall that our support had been covering. The numbers were stark and clear, leaving no room for Barbara to maintain any illusion that she had been managing independently. Seeing it laid out so explicitly seemed to affect Barbara more than anything else that had been said. Her financial dependence was no longer an abstract concept or a private arrangement between David and me. It was now documented, quantified, and being discussed openly among all her children. I could see her struggling with this loss of privacy and pride, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the paper David had placed on the coffee table. Part of me felt sympathy for her embarrassment, but a larger part recognized that this transparency was necessary, that the secrecy that had allowed her to avoid confronting her situation had also enabled her to judge others from a false position of superiority. Michael eventually agreed to contribute, though I could hear the reluctance in his voice as he committed to a specific monthly amount. It was less than what Jennifer had offered despite his higher income from construction management, and I saw Jennifer's jaw tighten at the discrepancy, but she didn't call him out on it directly. David thanked them both and explained that he would set up a simple system where each sibling contributed to a joint account that would then cover the agreed-upon expenses for Barbara. He made clear that this arrangement was contingent on Barbara, moving to a more affordable apartment within the next 3 months, something that would reduce the monthly support needed and make the contributions from all 3 siblings sustainable long-term. Barbara protested immediately, saying that she loved her current apartment, that all her friends lived in the same complex, that moving would uproot her entire social life. Her objections came quickly, desperately, and I could hear the panic beneath them. Her apartment at Maplewood Senior Living Complex had represented more than just housing. It had been a symbol of her status, proof that she was managing well in retirement, a space where she could host her friends and maintain the image of comfortable independence. Losing it meant losing face among her social circle, admitting that she couldn't actually afford the lifestyle she had been portraying. David remained firm, explaining that the current rent was simply not sustainable, that even with all 3 siblings contributing, the amount needed to maintain her there would be unreasonable and would limit what other support they could provide. He had researched several alternative senior living communities that were well maintained and had active social programs, but cost significantly less. He offered to tour them with her, to help her find a place she could be comfortable in, but he made clear that staying at Maplewood was not an option unless she could find a way to cover more of the costs herself. Jennifer supported this position, adding that perhaps a fresh start might actually be good for Barbara, that maybe some of her current friendships had become more about maintaining appearances than genuine connection. This observation seemed to sting, and I wondered if Jennifer had some insight into her mother's social circle that the rest of us lacked. Barbara opened her mouth to argue further but seemed to recognize that she had no leverage here, that her children were unified in this requirement, and that refusing would likely mean losing their support entirely and facing even worse financial consequences. The conversation shifted then to logistics and timelines. David outlined when he would help Barbara start looking at new apartments, when they would need to give notice at her current complex, how the transition of financial support from our private arrangement to the sibling shared system would work. It was all very practical and detailed, turning the emotional confrontation into an administrative process, which seemed to help everyone calm down and focus on concrete steps, rather than dwelling on feelings and conflicts. As the meeting began to wind down, Michael asked the question that had probably been on his mind throughout but that he had been hesitant to voice. He wanted to know what this meant for family before she could voice this objection, pointing out that plenty of adult children didn't give their parents keys, that it wasn't a reflection of love or family bonds, but simply a matter of privacy and autonomy. She looked at Michael and mentioned that she had never had a key to his place either, normalizing the boundary I was setting and making it harder for Barbara to frame it as a specific rejection. David added that he supported all the boundaries I had outlined, and that he would be implementing some of his own as well. He explained that he loved his mother and wanted her in his life, but that his marriage had to be his priority, and that meant standing with me when his family relationships became harmful to our partnership. He told Barbara directly that the pattern of her questioning me behind my back to him, trying to plant seeds of doubt about my character or my recovery, needed to stop completely. He made clear that he wouldn't engage with those conversations anymore, that if she had concerns she should address them directly with me in a respectful manner or keep them to herself. The firmness in David's voice seemed to finally penetrate Barbara's defenses in a way that nothing else had. Her son, the one she had been trying to protect from what she saw as my parasitic dependence, was making clear that he saw the situation entirely differently, that he viewed her behavior rather than mine as the problem that needed to be corrected. I could see the reality settling over her, the understanding that she had miscalculated badly, and that her attempts to drive a wedge between David and me had instead united us, and cost her the privileged access to our lives that she had previously enjoyed. Jennifer stood first, signaling that the meeting had run its course and that continuing would likely just result in circular conversations or renewed arguments. She hugged David, then came over to me and squeezed my hand, telling me quietly that she hoped I continued to recover well, and that she was sorry I had been put in this position. Her support meant more than I had expected, a reminder that not all of David's family viewed me as an outsider or a threat. Michael followed suit, though his goodbye was more awkward, a nod to David and a general statement about hoping things would work out. Barbara gathered her things slowly, clearly reluctant to leave, perhaps sensing that walking out this door meant accepting all the changes that had been discussed. She approached David first, touching his arm and saying something I couldn't quite hear, though I saw him nod and give her a brief hug. Then unexpectedly she turned to me. She didn't try to hug me or touch me, respecting the distance I had maintained throughout the meeting, but she looked directly at me and said that she would try to do better, that she understood she had hurt me, and that she hoped we could eventually move past this. I nodded, accepting her statement without committing to anything beyond continued civility. I told her that I appreciated her willingness to work on things, and that I hoped time would allow us to rebuild some level of trust. It wasn't warm or effusive, but it was honest, and I thought honesty was what we needed more than false assurances that everything would be fine. She seemed to accept this, giving a small nod before finally turning and walking out to her car, her posture showing the weight of everything she was carrying with her. After everyone left, the house felt enormously quiet. David and I stood in the living room, looking at the spaces where his family had been sitting, processing everything that had just happened. He turned to me and pulled me into a gentle hug, careful of my still healing body, and thanked me for handling everything with such grace. I laughed a little at that, pointing out that I hadn't felt particularly graceful during most of the confrontation, but he insisted that standing up for yourself while still being willing to find a path forward required a kind of grace that he deeply respected. We spent the rest of the day quietly, both of us exhausted from the emotional intensity of the family meeting. I returned to my recovery routine, doing my physical therapy exercises and resting as needed, but I felt different somehow, lighter despite the difficulty of the conversations. I realized that I had been carrying the weight of Barbara's unspoken judgments for a long time, probably since long before my surgery, feeling her subtle disapproval and criticism even when it wasn't voiced directly. Having everything out in the open, having the financial reality acknowledged, having boundaries clearly stated, all of it had lifted a burden I hadn't fully recognized I was bearing. Over the following weeks, Barbara did make efforts to respect the boundaries we had established. She called before visiting rather than showing up unannounced. She returned the house key without complaint when David specifically requested it. She stopped making comments about my recovery timeline or suggesting that I should be doing more. The changes were visible and appreciated, though I could sense the effort they required from her, the constant self-monitoring necessary to break old patterns of behavior. David helped his mother look at apartments and found one that was smaller but still comfortable, in a complex that had an active community center and regular social activities. The rent was almost $400 less per month than Maplewood, a significant reduction that made the shared support from her 3 children much more manageable. Barbara was melancholy about the move but handled it with more grace than I had expected, perhaps recognizing that complaining would only alienate the children who were working together to support her. Jennifer proved to be an unexpected ally in the aftermath of the family meeting. She called me a few times just to check on my recovery, conversations that gradually expanded beyond polite health inquiries to more genuine connection. She shared some of her own experiences with their mother, stories that made me realize Barbara's tendency to be critical and controlling had affected all her children to varying degrees. Jennifer admitted that she had sometimes envied me, thinking that as the daughter-in-law rather than the daughter, I somehow escaped the worst of Barbara's judgment. Learning that I had been subjected to similar criticism, while simultaneously providing substantial financial support, had shifted Jennifer's entire perspective on family dynamics. Michael remained more distant, though he did follow through on his financial commitments. I suspected he was still processing his own feelings about the situation, perhaps grappling with guilt that he hadn't contributed to his mother's support earlier or embarrassment that his sister-in-law had been more generous than he had been. Whatever his internal process, he kept it private, maintaining cordial but surface-level interactions at family gatherings. My physical recovery continued steadily, and by the 3-month mark after surgery, I had regained most of my strength and mobility. The doctors were pleased with my progress, and I was finally cleared to return to work on a modified schedule. Going back to my consulting practice felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. Engaging my mind in the analytical work I loved and reconnecting with clients who had been understanding about my medical leave. The work energized me in ways that rest alone never could, reminding me of my competence and value beyond the domestic sphere where I had been confined during recovery. The first family holiday after the confrontation was Thanksgiving, and I approached it with some trepidation, unsure how the dynamics would play out in a less formal setting than the family meeting had been. We hosted at our house, and I had made clear to David that I would contribute to the meal preparation but wouldn't overextend myself physically, that this needed to be a shared effort rather than me proving I was fully recovered by taking on everything myself. He agreed immediately and recruited Jennifer to help with side dishes while he handled the turkey. Barbara arrived with a pie she had baked, a small gesture that I recognized as an olive branch. She complimented the house, thanked us for hosting, and engaged in conversations without the edge of criticism that had previously colored her interactions with me. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments of awkwardness when conversations would lag, or when someone would make a reference to the past that carried unintended weight. But overall, the day was pleasant, a tentative proof that families could survive confrontations and come out the other side changed but intact. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened with a perspective that only distance can provide. The confrontation with Barbara had been painful and difficult, but it had also been necessary. Living under the weight of her unacknowledged judgment while providing financial support she refused to recognize had been slowly poisoning my relationship with her and creating tension in my marriage to David. Bringing everything into the light, as harsh as that illumination had been, had actually created the possibility for authentic relationship rather than the pretense we had been maintaining. I also recognized that my experience during recovery, as difficult as it had been, had taught me important lessons about vulnerability and strength. I had always prided myself on being independent and self-sufficient, on never needing help from anyone. The surgery and the extended recovery had forced me into dependence whether I liked it or not, and Barbara's reaction to my vulnerability had shown me how some people respond to others' weakness with contempt rather than compassion. But it had also shown me that true strength wasn't about never needing help but about knowing your worth even when you did, about setting boundaries even from a position of physical weakness, about standing up for yourself even when doing so was uncomfortable and costly. The financial transparency that had emerged from the confrontation had also changed my perspective on generosity and recognition. I had initially believed that helping Barbara secretly was the kindest approach, that preserving her dignity by hiding her dependence was a gift. But I had learned that generosity without acknowledgement can breed resentment on both sides. I had resented her judgment while she remained ignorant of her reliance on me, and she had felt free to criticize precisely because she didn't recognize what I was contributing. The new arrangement, where support was acknowledged and shared among siblings, felt more sustainable because it was honest, because everyone knew what was being given and received. David and I also grew closer through the experience. Our relationship strengthened by facing a difficult family conflict together, rather than letting it drive a wedge between us. He had learned to balance his love for his mother with his commitment to our marriage, and I had learned that I could trust him to stand with me even when doing so disappointed or hurt his family of origin. These weren't easy lessons, but they were valuable ones, the kind that only come through navigating actual challenges rather than abstract discussions about loyalty and priorities. By the time a full year had passed since the initial confrontation, our family had settled into new patterns that worked better for everyone, even if they looked different from what had existed before. Barbara had adjusted to her new apartment and had made friends in her community. She maintained relationships with all three of her children, but with healthier boundaries that gave everyone more breathing room. David and I had recovered financially from the years of solo support, and were back on track with our own savings and goals. Jennifer had become someone I genuinely considered a friend rather than just a sister-in-law. Even Michael had warmed up somewhat, though he would probably never be as close. The scars from being called a parasite had healed, though they hadn't disappeared entirely. Some words cut deep enough that you never forget them completely, and I knew that Barbara's judgment during my most vulnerable time would always be part of our history. But I had also proven to myself that I could face betrayal and cruelty without being destroyed by them, that I could demand respect even when it wasn't freely given, that I could be generous without being taken advantage of once boundaries were clear. Looking back, I realized that the revelation of who had been paying Barbara's fees had been powerful not because it humiliated her, though it certainly had, but because it forced everyone to confront reality instead of comfortable fictions. The fiction that Barbara was financially independent. The fiction that I was somehow dependent or parasitic. The fiction that family relationships could be healthy without honesty and boundaries. All of those fictions had been destroyed in that confrontation, and while the truth had been painful, it had also been liberating in ways I was still discovering. As I sat on our back deck one evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, David joined me with 2 glasses of wine. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that comes from genuine peace rather than unspoken tension. He thanked me again for how I had handled everything with his mother, and I thanked him for standing with me when it mattered. We toasted to honesty, to boundaries, to families that survive their own dysfunction and find ways forward, to partnerships strong enough to weather storms together. The experience had changed me in ways both obvious and subtle. I was more confident in my right to set boundaries, more willing to confront problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves, more aware of my own worth and less willing to accept treatment that diminished it. I had learned that being called a parasite by someone who was actually dependent on your support said everything about them and nothing about you. I had learned that recovery, whether physical or emotional, happens on its own timeline and can't be rushed by others' impatience or judgment. And I had learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop protecting people from the truth and let reality speak for itself. The spring following that tumultuous autumn brought changes I hadn't anticipated when the confrontation first happened. My return to full-time work had been gradual but steady, and by April I found myself not just back to my previous client load, but actually expanding my consulting practice in ways that felt exciting rather than overwhelming. The months of forced rest during recovery had given me time to think about the direction of my career, and I had emerged with clarity about what I wanted to build. I started being more selective about which clients I took on, focusing on projects that aligned with my values and expertise, rather than simply accepting any work that came my way. One unexpected benefit of the entire ordeal with Barbara was that it had strengthened my professional confidence in ways I hadn't predicted. Standing up to her, documenting the financial support we had provided, and clearly articulating boundaries had reminded me of skills I used daily in my consulting work but had somehow failed to apply in my personal life. I had always been comfortable advocating for clients, analyzing complex financial situations, and presenting difficult truths to business stakeholders. The confrontation with Barbara had forced me to use those same skills in defense of myself, and the experience had somehow integrated my professional and personal selves in a way that made me more effective in both spheres. I started teaching a workshop for young professional women about financial literacy and boundary setting, drawing on my own experience without sharing specific details of the family situation. The workshops were held monthly at a local community center, and they quickly filled up with women eager to learn not just about managing money but about protecting their financial autonomy in relationships. I talked about the importance of maintaining separate accounts, about how to have difficult conversations about money with partners and family members, about recognizing when generosity crosses the line into enabling harmful patterns. The women who attended came from all backgrounds and situations, but the conversations we had convinced me that my experience with Barbara, while specific in its details, touched on dynamics that were nearly universal. David watched this evolution with pride and support, often telling me that watching me channel the pain of what happened with his mother into something that helped others was one of the things he most admired about me. Our marriage had deepened in ways that only shared adversity can create, the kind of intimacy that comes from knowing your partner will stand with you even when doing so costs them something significant. He had lost the easy relationship he once had with his mother, at least temporarily, and I knew that sacrifice hadn't been simple or painless for him. But he never once suggested that I should have handled things differently, never implied that preserving his relationship with Barbara should have taken precedence over defending me. Barbara herself continued to show improvement in respecting boundaries, though I could sometimes sense the effort it required from her. She had joined a book club at her new apartment complex and had started volunteering at a local food bank, activities that seemed to give her purpose and social connection beyond just her family relationships. When we did see her at family gatherings, she was more likely to ask questions about my work with genuine interest rather than making veiled criticisms disguised as concern. She asked about the workshops I was teaching, and I could see her processing the irony that the financial skills she had dismissed during her criticism of me were now something I was being paid to teach others. There was a moment during Easter dinner at Jennifer's house when Barbara and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, both reaching for serving spoons at the same moment. We paused, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something vulnerable and almost seeking. She told me that she had been thinking a lot about what had happened, about the things she had said and the way she had judged me. She admitted that part of her harshness had come from her own fear of becoming dependent, her own terror of losing her independence as she aged. Watching me during my recovery, seeing me need help with basic tasks, had triggered something in her because it reflected her own deepest fears about her future. This admission was the most honest Barbara had ever been with me, and I recognized the courage it took for her to offer this glimpse into her internal world. I told her that I understood fear could make people cruel, that watching our own vulnerabilities reflected in others was difficult. I shared that my recovery had forced me to confront my own discomfort with dependence, that I had struggled with accepting help even when I desperately needed it. For a moment, in that kitchen with the sounds of family laughter filtering in from the dining room, we connected as two women grappling with similar fears, rather than as adversary and victim. I didn't tell her that this one moment of honesty erased all the hurt she had caused, because it didn't. But I acknowledged that it was a meaningful step, that understanding where her cruelty came from didn't excuse it, but did make it more comprehensible. She nodded, seeming to understand that forgiveness was a process rather than a single decision, and we carried the serving dishes back to the dining room with something between us that felt different, less hostile, more human. Michael's wife, whom I had never been particularly close to, pulled me aside later that same afternoon and thanked me for how I had handled everything with Barbara. She admitted that she had experienced some of the same judgment and criticism from her mother-in-law over the years, but had never felt capable of confronting it directly. She said that watching the family dynamics shift after I had stood up for myself had given her hope that change was possible, that patterns didn't have to continue just because they had always existed. Her words reminded me that family systems are interconnected, that standing up to dysfunction in one relationship can have ripple effects throughout the entire network. As summer approached, I received an invitation to speak at a regional conference for financial professionals about the intersection of personal finance and family dynamics. The organizer had heard about my workshops and thought my perspective on how financial entanglements complicate family relationships would resonate with an audience of advisors who often found themselves counseling clients through similar situations. I accepted the invitation with some nervousness, aware that speaking to a room full of professionals was different from facilitating intimate workshops with small groups of women. Preparing the presentation forced me to really analyze what I had learned from the experience with Barbara, and to articulate it in ways that would be useful to others. I realized that one of the key lessons was about the danger of hidden generosity, how supporting someone financially while keeping it secret can create a toxic dynamic where the recipient feels entitled to judge the giver, because they don't recognize their own dependence. I talked about the importance of transparency in financial family support, about setting clear expectations and boundaries before patterns become entrenched, about the difference between helping someone and enabling them to avoid confronting reality. The presentation was scheduled for late June, and as the date approached, I found myself thinking about whether to mention it to Barbara. Part of me wanted to keep my professional life separate from our still fragile personal relationship, but another part recognized that excluding her from this significant event sent its own message. I finally mentioned it casually at a Sunday brunch at our house, framing it as just another work commitment without emphasizing its significance. Barbara surprised me by asking if she could attend, saying she would be interested in hearing me speak professionally since she had never really understood what I did for a living. The request caught me off guard, and I saw David's eyebrows raise slightly across the table, equally surprised by his mother's interest. I told her it was a professional conference and might be dry for someone not in the finance field, giving her an easy out if she was just being polite. But she insisted she was genuinely curious, and something about the directness of her request made me agree. I sent her the registration information, half expecting her to change her mind as the date got closer, but she followed through, registering and confirming her attendance. The day of the conference arrived with typical summer heat, the convention center's air conditioning struggling against the warmth of hundreds of bodies packed into various sessions and presentations. I had arrived early to test the audiovisual equipment and run through my slides one final time, my nerves manifesting as the meticulous preparation that had always characterized my professional approach. I spotted Barbara entering the room about 15 minutes before my session was scheduled to begin, dressed more formally than I usually saw her, clearly taking the event seriously. She took a seat near the middle of the room, not front and center where her presence would be obvious to me throughout the presentation, but also not hidden in the back. I appreciated the thoughtfulness of her positioning, The recognition that this was my professional space and she was there to observe rather than to make herself the focus. As the room filled with financial advisors, consultants, and wealth managers, I felt my nerves settle into the focused energy that always came before a good presentation. I began by outlining the basic premise that family financial entanglements are often about much more than money, that they involve power, identity, love, obligation, and fear in complex combinations that can't be solved with simple spreadsheets or budgets. I shared anonymous case studies, including a version of my own situation with identifying details changed, describing how a couple had supported a family member for years while keeping it secret to preserve dignity, only to have that generosity backfire when the recipient felt free to judge them harshly precisely because they didn't recognize their own dependence. I could see people throughout the room nodding, taking notes, clearly recognizing similar situations from their own client experiences or personal lives. I talked about the importance of having difficult conversations early, of making financial support transparent and time-limited when possible, of distinguishing between temporary help during a crisis versus ongoing subsidies that enable unsustainable lifestyles. I discussed the psychological dynamics that make these conversations so hard, the shame and pride that prevent people from being honest about their situations, the way family loyalty can be weaponized to prevent necessary boundaries. Throughout the presentation, I was aware of Barbara in the audience, though I tried not to look directly at her too often. When I did glance her way, I saw her listening intently, her expression serious and thoughtful. I wondered what she was thinking, whether hearing these dynamics discussed in professional terms with clinical distance made her see our family situation differently, whether the anonymized version of our story that I included was recognizable to her or sufficiently disguised. The question and answer session after my presentation was lively, with advisors sharing their own challenging cases and asking for guidance on how to counsel clients through similar situations. One woman asked how to help clients set boundaries with family members without destroying relationships, and I found myself drawing on my still developing relationship with Barbara as I answered. I talked about how boundaries don't have to be punitive, how they can actually create space for healthier relationships by making expectations clear and preventing resentment from building. I acknowledged that there's often a period of adjustment that feels uncomfortable for everyone, but that discomfort is different from damage, that relationships which can't survive honesty and boundaries probably weren't as healthy as they appeared. Another advisor asked about the gendered dynamics of family financial support, noting that in his experience, it was often daughters and daughters-in-law who ended up providing care and support while sons and sons-in-law faced less expectation or criticism. I acknowledged this pattern and talked about how women are often socialized to be caregivers and to prioritize relationships even at personal cost, while also being judged more harshly when they need support themselves. I pointed out that the double standard I had experienced, being called a parasite during my recovery while unknowingly supporting the person who criticized me, had gendered elements that couldn't be ignored. As the session concluded and people began filtering out, several attendees approached to thank me and share their own stories. I spoke with each person who waited, aware that Barbara was also waiting off to the side, but not wanting to rush these professional connections. When I finally made my way over to her, I wasn't sure what to expect. Her face was composed but serious, and she asked if we could talk privately. My stomach tightened, wondering if hearing our family dynamics discussed in a professional forum had angered her, or if she felt exposed despite the anonymization. We found a quiet corner in the convention center lobby, away from the bustle of conference attendees moving between sessions. Barbara started by saying that listening to my presentation had been difficult but important for her. She said that hearing the dynamics I described, even though she knew I was talking about our situation in generalized terms, had helped her understand what had happened between us from a different perspective. She admitted that she had never thought of herself as dependent or being supported by us, that she had somehow managed to ignore the mathematical impossibility of her pension covering her lifestyle because acknowledging it would have forced her to confront realities she wasn't ready to face. She told me that hearing me discuss how hidden generosity can create toxic dynamics had made her realize that our decision to support her secretly, while well-intentioned, had actually enabled her to maintain illusions that ultimately hurt everyone. She said she understood now why I had been so hurt by her calling me a parasite, that the word had special cruelty when she herself had been the one actually dependent on my income. She apologized again, more fully than she had in the kitchen at Easter, acknowledging specific ways she had been cruel and judgmental not just during my recovery but in smaller ways over the years of my marriage to David. I listened to this apology, more comprehensive and genuine than any she had offered before, and felt something in my chest release slightly. I told her that I appreciated her willingness to see the situation from my perspective, that I knew it couldn't have been easy to sit through a professional presentation that implicitly discussed her behavior. I acknowledged that David and I had made mistakes too, that keeping the financial support secret had seemed kind at the time but had created problems we hadn't foreseen. I said that I hoped we could continue moving forward with more honesty and less judgment on both sides. Barbara nodded and then said something that surprised me. She asked if I would be willing to have coffee with her regularly, just the two of us, to try to build a relationship that was ours rather than just an extension of her connection to David. She said that listening to me present had made her realize that I was someone worth knowing in my own right, not just as her son's wife, and that she regretted spending years keeping me at arm's length because she had felt threatened by my place in David's life. The vulnerability in this admission, the recognition of her own insecurity and the damage it had caused, moved me more than I expected. I agreed to the coffee meetings, suggesting we start with once a month and see how it went. I made clear that I appreciated her willingness to build something new, but that trust would take time to develop, that I needed to see consistent change rather than just good intentions. She accepted these terms without argument, seeming to understand that she had forfeited the right to immediate closeness through her previous behavior. We left the conference center with a tentative plan to meet the following week at a cafe halfway between our homes. The coffee meetings became a regular part of my routine over the following months, and they were often awkward at first as we navigated how to talk to each other without the buffer of David or other family members. But gradually we found topics of genuine mutual interest. Barbara had strong opinions about books and current events, and once she stopped using those opinions as weapons to judge others, she was actually interesting to talk with. I shared more about my work and my workshops, and she began offering perspectives from her generation about how different financial and family dynamics had been in her own young adulthood. One afternoon in late fall, nearly a year after my conference presentation, Barbara told me something that recontextualized much of her earlier behavior. She admitted that when her husband had died and she had realized how little his pension would cover, she had felt terrified and ashamed. She had gone to Michael first asking for help, and he had made her feel so guilty about needing support that she had never asked again. She had been too proud to admit to Jennifer or David that she was struggling, so she had just quietly fallen behind on bills and hoped somehow it would work out. When the support had mysteriously started appearing, she had chosen not to question it too closely because acknowledging it would have meant facing how dependent she had become. She said that her harshness toward me during my recovery had been partly because watching me accept help openly, without shame, had highlighted her own inability to do the same. She had judged me for what she saw as weakness, but what she was really reacting to was my willingness to be vulnerable in ways she had never allowed herself to be. This admission helped me understand that her cruelty had been less about me specifically and more about her own unprocessed feelings about dependence, aging, and loss of control. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it did make it more comprehensible within the context of her own struggles. I shared with her that my recovery had forced me to confront similar fears, that accepting help had been one of the hardest parts of the entire experience. I told her about the nights I had cried in frustration at my body's limitations, about how I had pushed myself too hard trying to regain independence faster than was medically advisable, about my own discomfort with being seen as weak or needy. In sharing these vulnerabilities with each other, we found an unexpected common ground. Two women from different generations grappling with similar fears about autonomy and dependence in a culture that values self-sufficiency above almost everything else. David noticed the changes in both of us, commenting one evening that his mother seemed happier and less defensive than he had seen her in years. He said that our developing friendship, unexpected as it had been, seemed to be good for both of us, that we were somehow bringing out better versions of each other than had existed when our relationship was only defined by his position between us. I agreed, recognizing that the forced honesty of our confrontation, painful as it had been, had actually created the possibility for authentic connection in a way that the previous polite distance never could have. The workshops I was teaching continued to grow, and I eventually decided to turn the content into a book proposal. David encouraged this project enthusiastically, And surprisingly, so did Barbara when I mentioned it during one of our coffee meetings. She offered to share her perspective as someone who had been on the receiving end of hidden family financial support, and we discussed whether there might be a chapter that included multiple viewpoints on the same situation. The idea of collaborating with her on anything would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of our conflict, but enough time and healing had passed that it actually seemed potentially valuable. As the second anniversary of my surgery approached, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had been transformed by what had started as a medical crisis. The surgery itself had been necessary and ultimately successful, my body healed and functioning normally again. But the real transformation had been in my relationships and my sense of self. I had learned that I could be vulnerable without being weak, that I could accept help without losing my identity, that I could set firm boundaries even with family members without being cruel or destroying relationships entirely. The experience with Barbara had taught me that sometimes the people who hurt us are dealing with their own pain and fear, and that understanding their struggles doesn't mean accepting their mistreatment, but can inform how we respond to it. It had shown me that transparency in family financial matters, while sometimes awkward, prevents the kind of toxic dynamics that secrecy enables. It had reinforced that my worth wasn't dependent on my productivity or independence, that I had value even when I was physically limited and needed support from others. Most importantly, the entire ordeal had deepened my marriage in ways that only shared challenges can accomplish. David and I had been tested and had emerged with greater trust and intimacy than we had before. We had learned to communicate more directly about difficult topics, to support each other even when doing so created tension with other important relationships, to prioritize our partnership while still maintaining connections with extended family. These weren't lessons we could have learned from books or therapy alone. They required actual navigation of real conflicts with real consequences. Jennifer had also become a genuine friend, rather than just a sister-in-law. Our bond strengthened by shared experiences of navigating Barbara's complicated personality. We had started having lunch together monthly, separate from family gatherings, and those conversations ranged from deep discussions about family dynamics to lighter topics about books and movies, and the challenges of balancing career and personal life. She had been there for me during my recovery in ways that went beyond obligation, and I tried to reciprocate by being present for her struggles with her teenage daughter and her questions about her own career trajectory. Even Michael had softened, though he would probably never be particularly close to me. He had stopped being defensive about family finances and had actually increased his monthly contribution to Barbara's support after his business had a particularly profitable year. He had apologized, briefly and awkwardly, for not believing me initially when I had outlined what I had overheard Barbara saying. The apology had been stiff and uncomfortable, very much in character for Michael, but the fact that he had offered it at all represented significant growth. Barbara's move to the more affordable apartment had turned out better than anyone expected. She had initially approached it as a demotion, a loss of status, but the community there was actually more active and welcoming than her previous complex had been. She had made friends who seemed to value her for herself rather than for the image of affluence she had worked so hard to project at Maplewood. She had started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago, and her apartment was now filled with watercolors of landscapes and flowers that showed genuine talent. The financial structure we had established, with all three siblings contributing proportionally, had proven sustainable and had actually improved relationships among the siblings themselves. They were communicating more regularly about their mother's needs and well-being, sharing the emotional labor of family support in addition to the financial burden. This distribution meant that no one felt overwhelmed or resentful, and it had created space for all of them to have better individual relationships with Barbara, rather than one person bearing the full weight of her needs and expectations. As I sat down to outline the book proposal, drawing on my professional expertise and my personal experience, I found myself grateful for the journey despite its difficulty. The woman who had called me a parasite during my recovery had become someone I could have coffee with, someone whose fear and vulnerability I could understand even while holding her accountable for how those feelings had manifested as cruelty toward me. The relationship wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was real and honest in a way that the previous pretense of cordiality had never been. I had learned that revealing who paid the fees, exposing the hidden financial support, had been necessary not to humiliate Barbara but to force all of us to deal with reality instead of comfortable fictions. The truth had been painful for everyone involved, but it had also been liberating, creating space for genuine relationships built on honesty rather than assumptions and unspoken resentments. And perhaps most importantly, I had learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and costly, is not selfishness but necessary self-respect, the foundation on which all healthy relationships must be built. The book proposal I had been working on evolved into something more comprehensive than I had originally envisioned. What started as a straightforward guide to navigating family financial dynamics grew into a deeper exploration of how money intersects with identity, power, and love within family systems. My literary agent, whom I had connected with through a colleague at the financial consulting firm, was enthusiastic about the project and suggested expanding it to include not just practical advice but personal narratives that would help readers see themselves in the stories. I spent long evenings at my desk, the view from my home office window shifting from autumn leaves to winter bareness as I drafted chapters that wove together professional expertise and hard-won personal insights. David would bring me tea and read sections I was struggling with, offering feedback about clarity and emotional resonance. He had become my first reader, the person who could tell me when I was being too clinical and when I was letting emotion overwhelm the practical guidance. His support during this creative process mirrored the support he had given me during my physical recovery, steady and unwavering, even when I was frustrated or doubting myself. Barbara had agreed to contribute a sidebar for one chapter, offering her perspective on receiving hidden financial support and how the secrecy had affected her relationship with herself and with us. Writing her piece had been challenging for her, requiring her to articulate thoughts and feelings she had spent years avoiding. She shared drafts with me over our coffee meetings, and I watched her grapple with how honest to be, how much vulnerability to show. The final version she submitted was raw and authentic, acknowledging her pride and fear in ways that made her deeply human, rather than simply the antagonist in my personal story. Reading her contribution reminded me that everyone is the protagonist of their own narrative, that Barbara's story of aging, loss, and struggling to maintain independence was as real and valid as my story of being judged during vulnerability. The book was becoming less about assigning blame and more about understanding how good people can hurt each other when fear and shame prevent honest communication. I hoped readers would see themselves in multiple characters rather than simply identifying with one perspective, that the complexity of family dynamics would come through in ways that felt true to real life, rather than simplified morality tales. Jennifer also contributed to the project, writing about her experience watching family conflict from the sibling perspective, and how hard it was to know when to intervene and when to stay neutral. Her reflections on feeling caught between loyalty to her mother and recognition that I had been treated unfairly added another dimension to the family dynamics section. She wrote about the guilt she felt for not speaking up sooner, for allowing patterns to continue because confronting them felt too uncomfortable. Her honesty about her own complicity through silence was powerful, and gave the book a fuller picture of how family dysfunction persists because everyone plays a role in maintaining it. The manuscript deadline coincided with the approach of the 3rd anniversary of my surgery, and I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in those 3 years. The physical scars had faded to thin white lines barely visible unless you knew where to look. The emotional scars had transformed into something different, not exactly healed but integrated into who I had become. I was no longer the person who had gone into surgery 3 years ago, confident in her independence and uncomfortable with vulnerability. The woman I had become understood that strength included the capacity to need others, that self-sufficiency was sometimes just another word for isolation. My consulting practice had evolved as well, shaped by the insights I had gained from my personal experience. I found myself drawn to clients who were navigating transitions, whether professional or personal, and I brought a depth of understanding to their situations that went beyond financial analysis. I could recognize when someone's financial decisions were being driven by fear or pride, rather than logic. I could help clients see patterns they were perpetuating without realizing it. My own journey through vulnerability and recovery and conflict had made me a better consultant, because it had deepened my capacity for empathy, while also strengthening my commitment to honesty, even when truth was uncomfortable. The workshops I taught had also transformed, incorporating more storytelling and less lecture, creating space for participants to share their own experiences, rather than just absorbing information. Women would stay after sessions to tell me their own stories of family financial conflict, of being judged for needing help, of providing support that went unacknowledged. I heard versions of my own story reflected back at me in different contexts and circumstances, and each telling reinforced my belief that what had happened with Barbara was not unique but rather emblematic of broader cultural and familial patterns around money, gender, and care. One workshop participant, a woman named Patricia who was about Barbara's age, stayed after everyone else had left and told me that listening to me had made her realize she had treated her own daughter-in-law with similar judgment. She said she had been critical of how the younger woman managed her household and career, making comments disguised as concern while actually coming from a place of feeling threatened by changes she didn't understand. She asked for advice on how to repair the relationship, and I found myself drawing on my evolving connection with Barbara as I offered suggestions. I emphasized the importance of genuine apology, of acknowledging specific harms rather than offering vague regrets, of being patient with the process of rebuilding trust. Patricia came back to several subsequent workshops and eventually reported that she and her daughter-in-law were making progress, that honest conversations were replacing passive-aggressive comments, that she was learning to ask questions instead of making judgments. Hearing her story reminded me that change was possible at any age, that patterns could be broken if people were willing to do the uncomfortable work of examining their own behavior and motivations. It gave me hope that the healing happening in my own family wasn't exceptional, but rather what became possible when people chose honesty and growth over comfortable dysfunction. The manuscript was finally complete in early spring, submitted to publishers with my agent's confident prediction that we would receive multiple offers. The waiting period was anxious, weeks of uncertainty about whether the vulnerability I had poured onto those pages would resonate with editors and eventually readers. I tried to focus on other aspects of my work and life, but the book had become so intertwined with my own healing process that waiting for external validation felt more personal than any professional project I had undertaken before. David planned a small celebration dinner for just the two of us on the evening. I sent the final manuscript to my agent, acknowledging that this completion represented something more than just a professional milestone. Over wine and the fancy steaks he had grilled, we talked about how writing the book had forced me to process the experience with Barbara from multiple angles, to move beyond my own hurt feelings and see the larger patterns and dynamics at play. He said he had watched me transform pain into purpose, and that my willingness to be vulnerable in my writing would help others feel less alone in their own family struggles. I asked him if it had been difficult to read the chapters that dealt with our family situation, even anonymized and generalized as they were. He admitted that some passages had been hard, particularly the sections where I described feeling alone and unsupported before he had fully recognized how his mother was treating me. But he said that facing those difficult truths had been important for him too, that it had reinforced his commitment to being the kind of partner who showed up even when situations were messy and complicated. He thanked me for being willing to work through everything with him, rather than simply leaving when things got hard, acknowledging that many people would have seen the family conflict as insurmountable. News came 3 weeks later that 2 publishers were interested and wanted to schedule calls to discuss their vision for the book. My agent was thrilled and began negotiating between them, ultimately securing an offer that included not just publication, but also a commitment to substantial marketing support and a companion workbook for readers who wanted to apply the principles to their own situations. Signing the contract felt surreal, the culmination of a journey that had begun in pain and vulnerability, and somehow transformed into something that might help others navigate similar challenges. Barbara's reaction to the news was one of the surprises that marked how far our relationship had come. She insisted on taking me to lunch to celebrate, just the two of us, and over salads at a restaurant she had chosen. She told me she was proud of me. The words were simple but carried weight because I knew they were genuine, that the woman who had once called me a parasite now genuinely celebrated my success. She said that being part of the project, even in a small way through her sidebar contribution, had been meaningful to her because it gave her a chance to turn her mistakes into something potentially useful for others. She admitted she was nervous about friends and extended family potentially recognizing themselves in the stories despite the anonymization, but that she had decided her discomfort was less important than the possibility that the book might help prevent other families from making the same mistakes. This willingness to prioritize purpose over pride represented significant growth from the woman who had been so concerned with maintaining appearances 3 years earlier. I thanked her for her courage in contributing and for her support of the project, acknowledging that it couldn't have been easy to see our conflict discussed even in generalized terms. The book was scheduled for publication in the fall, just over 4 years after my surgery, and the months leading up to release were filled with final edits, cover design discussions, and planning for the book tour that would take me to several cities for speaking engagements and workshops. David took time off work to travel with me for at least part of the tour, recognizing that while this was my professional project, the emotional labor of sharing such personal material publicly would be easier with his support. Jennifer offered to help coordinate a launch event in our city, volunteering to handle logistics so I could focus on the actual speaking and signing. Barbara asked if she could attend the launch event, and I found myself genuinely wanting her there, wanting her to see the tangible result of the journey we had all been on together. I told her I would be honored if she came, and I meant it sincerely. The woman who had once been my antagonist had become someone whose presence at important moments in my life felt appropriate and even necessary, a witness to transformation that we had undergone together, rather than separately. The launch event drew a larger crowd than I had anticipated. The bookstore's event space packed with professional contacts, workshop participants, friends, and family. I spoke about the book's themes without disclosing that much of it was drawn from personal experience, focusing on the universal challenges families face when money, care, and changing relationships intersect. During the question and answer session, someone asked if the stories in the book were based on real situations, and I acknowledged that they drew on both my professional experience as a consultant and personal observations about family dynamics, leaving it ambiguous enough to protect everyone's privacy, while being honest about the authentic foundation of the work. Barbara sat in the third row next to David and Jennifer, and I watched her face as I discussed themes that I knew resonated with her own experience. She nodded at several points, and I saw her wipe away tears during a section where I talked about how fear of dependence can make aging individuals push away the very people trying to help them. After the formal program ended and I moved to the signing table, Barbara waited until most of the line had cleared before approaching with her copy of the book. She opened it to the page with her sidebar contribution and asked me to sign right next to her name, creating a permanent record of our collaboration and the journey that had made it possible. As summer turned to fall and the book began appearing in stores and online, reviews started coming in that praised the balance between practical financial advice and emotional intelligence about family relationships. Several reviewers specifically mentioned the sidebar contributions from family members offering different perspectives, noting that this multi-perspective approach made the book feel more honest and complex than typical advice literature. Reading these responses validated my decision to include voices beyond my own, to make the project about understanding rather than simply being right. The book tour took me to 8 cities over 3 weeks, and each event drew people with stories similar to mine, families fractured over money and care, adult children struggling to support aging parents while maintaining their own boundaries, spouses caught between their partners and their families of origin. I heard the same themes repeated in different contexts, the same pain and confusion and desperate desire for guidance about how to navigate situations where love and obligation and resentment were all tangled together. Each conversation reinforced my belief that what had happened in my family was part of a much larger cultural pattern, that we collectively needed better models for how to handle these challenges. At the final tour stop, a woman approached me with a question that I had been asked in various forms throughout the tour, but that felt particularly poignant in this moment. She wanted to know if I had really forgiven my mother-in-law, or if I was just pretending for the sake of family peace. The question cut to the heart of something I had been processing throughout the writing and publicity process. I told her honestly that forgiveness wasn't a single decision but an ongoing choice, that some days I felt genuine warmth toward Barbara and other days, I still felt echoes of the hurt she had caused. I said that I had chosen to allow our relationship to evolve rather than staying frozen in the anger and pain of our worst moments, but that didn't mean I had forgotten what happened, or that there weren't still boundaries in place. I explained that forgiveness for me didn't mean pretending the harm hadn't occurred or trusting blindly without evidence of change. It meant being willing to see Barbara as a full human being with her own struggles and fears, rather than just as the person who had hurt me. It meant acknowledging the growth she had shown, and allowing that growth to matter without erasing the past. I told the woman that I thought true forgiveness was more complicated and ongoing than most people acknowledged, that it wasn't about achieving a perfect state of peace, but about being willing to stay in relationship despite imperfection. The question stayed with me on the flight home, and I found myself thinking about all the ways my relationship with Barbara had evolved and continued to evolve. We still had our monthly coffee meetings, though they now felt easy rather than obligatory. She still attended family gatherings and had learned to participate without dominating or criticizing. She had developed genuine friendships with her neighbors at the new apartment and seemed less dependent on her children for her entire social world. The financial arrangement was working, with all three siblings contributing consistently and Barbara living within the means that support provided rather than constantly exceeding her budget. But there were still moments of tension, times when old patterns would briefly resurface before one of us would recognize what was happening and course correct. There were conversations we still avoided because neither of us was quite ready to go there. There were wounds that had scarred over but remained tender to the touch. The relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real and functional, and allowed both of us to be part of David's life without constant conflict. That felt like enough, like success even if it didn't look like the idealized reconciliation that movies and books often portrayed. As I settled back into home life after the tour, I felt a profound sense of completion about this chapter of my life. The surgery that had started everything was now 4 years in the past. My body had fully healed and I was back to all my normal activities without limitation. The family crisis that had followed had been navigated, and had resulted in stronger boundaries and more honest relationships. The book that had emerged from all of it was now in the world, hopefully helping others avoid some of the pitfalls we had stumbled into. I had transformed personal pain into professional insight, and had emerged from the entire experience more confident in my own worth and capabilities. David and I sat on our back deck one evening, watching the same sunset view that had witnessed so many conversations over the past 4 years. He mentioned that his mother had told him recently how grateful she was that I had been willing to work through everything rather than simply cutting her out of our lives. He said she recognized that she had been given a second chance she probably didn't deserve, and that she was trying every day to be worthy of it. I squeezed his hand and told him that everyone deserves the chance to grow and change, that writing people off permanently should be a last resort rather than a first response. We talked about the future, about how the success of the book might create new opportunities for speaking and consulting, about whether we wanted to start a family of our own now that we had navigated these family challenges with his mother. The conversation wandered through possibilities and dreams, grounded in the confidence that whatever challenges came, we could face them together with honesty and mutual support. The experience with Barbara had taught us how to communicate through difficulty, how to stand together even when external pressures tried to divide us, how to protect our relationship while still maintaining connections with others we loved. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars became visible, I felt a deep sense of peace about everything that had happened. The woman who had called me a parasite during my recovery had inadvertently set in motion a series of events that had ultimately made me stronger, more self-aware, and more compassionate. The revelation of who had been paying her fees had shifted family dynamics in ways that were ultimately healthier even though the transition had been painful. And the relationship that had nearly been destroyed by cruelty and misunderstanding had been rebuilt into something more authentic and resilient than what had existed before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.